And I actually, he doesn't even know this, but I became sort of a blubbering fangirl based on a really, I thought, brilliant opinion piece that he wrote for the Jewish Light some time ago about the interaction between the Jewish community and the Black community within St. Louis. And I shouldn't quote him because I probably won't get it right, and I'll put in my own 2 cents. But my own 2 cents on that topic is that hanging a picture of the Reverend Dr. King somewhere in your building is really not good enough. There's a little more to it than that. So I should mention also that we chose this topic months ago, and well before people on the other side of the ocean started shooting at one another, which obviously does have some impact on both of our communities. And I'm sure we'll touch on it during the evening, but it's not our primary focus because there's plenty that we can do to better the situation of racial equity, racial inclusion in our own backyards, and that's our primary focus tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to Tony, who will start by sharing a little more of his background. Take it away. And would everyone mute themselves, please?
Nancy, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone who is on my screen. Let me actually switch it to gallery view because I like seeing everyone. Thank you so much for letting me come and talk to you. As Nancy said, I am Tony Westbrook. I currently serve as the Assistant Director of WashU Hillel here, and we are finishing a very long 15-month semester. We're actually now planning for the upcoming year, so that's what's sort of on the agenda. A little bit about myself. I am a St. Louis native. I went to Webster Groves High School. For the other St. Louis natives here, that's really the only important question that people want to know, or the answer to the question people want to know: where did you go to school? I am Black, Jewish, queer, a convert, lots of other things, and that really helps shape how I view Judaism, how I interact with the world, how I sort of bounce back and forth between the different communities that I am a part of. And so tonight, I'm gonna just talk a little bit. And I know at the end, Nancy has left some time for you all to ask questions. I wanna start off by saying I am by no means an expert in everything that we'll be talking about tonight. There are people out there that are significantly much more learned than I am. I am speaking from a place of experience. One of the things, and this will be the final thing before we go in, if you all are familiar with the program Cultural Leadership, started by Karen Kalish in 2004, I was part of the very first class. And so that experience has really shaped sort of my adult experience, and that was 16, 17 years ago. Okay, I'm just gonna start a little timer because I sort of planned this out and I wanna make sure. Okay, so in the piece that Nancy referenced, I wrote this, I would say last July, and it's still in the St. Louis, the Jewish Light. Actually, I have it here, so I will plop it. I invite you all to read that at your leisure at another time. But sort of the gist of what I was saying in that article, I was becoming very, very frustrated. This was right after one of the Eagles football players, Black, really sort of prominent public figure, took to Twitter and his Instagram and other social media outlets to say some really, really just gross anti-Semitic stuff. and immediately the Jewish community everywhere called him out on it. I think he ultimately, if I'm remembering correctly, was let go from the team. Julian Edelman reached out to him sort of as another Jewish football player to say, hey, I don't think you're saying this from a place of hatred. I think you just don't know anything about Jews or Judaism. Come over for a Shabbat meal. I'm happy to educate you. And the reason I ended up writing this piece, the reaction there was such a strong and visceral reaction. My social media was flooded with it. Every conversation that I was having with a Jewish friend, that was the conversation. But just months earlier, George Floyd was murdered. And for, I would say, sort of a 2-week period, all of my friends, it felt like much of the Jewish community, and when I say the Jewish community, I mean both sort of the St. Louis Jewish community as a whole and sort of the Jewish community in America. It felt like everyone was dedicated to fighting the good fight and posting things on social media. And then at some point, mid-June going into July, it all of a sudden just sort of fell quiet. And so my piece really was in response to that. And it really was sort of, I don't like to say calling people out because I don't think it's so productive when we're trying to have these conversations and when we're trying to really bring people into the fold. And so in my op-ed, what I really was trying to do was call people in to really think, I think in a critical manner about how they were sort of leveraging the really famous relationship of Rabbi Heschel and Reverend Martin Luther King, and really sort of playing with that. Even before that, in January, as we were coming up on MLK Day, I made a post that many St. Louis rabbis then emailed me about. And in my Facebook post, I simply said, if you haven't talked about racial equity or any of the things that are happening in our country right now for the last 10 months, please don't use a quote from Dr. King or a picture from Dr. King, because you're posting something one day and it's really this performative activism. You're not really moving the needle. And so I say that just to help us sort of frame the conversation. And I think when we think about racism, and I say specifically anti-Black racism, which is a term that I have started using really within the last 15 months. And I think it's really in the lexicon of many Americans right now. When we talk about anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, they are linked, but they are also very different. Anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism both stem from the ugly culture of white supremacy that has really become all too visible in recent years. I don't know who's not paying attention these days, but if you are paying attention, those two things are linked, and it's all sort of part of this white supremacist foundation. And so when we look at that, the differences between anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, particularly here in America, one was codified into laws. The country was built sort of around the oppression of one of the groups, and the other groups, because at the time weren't seen quote unquote as white, they fell into the non-white category. They were not desirable. When I'm saying they, sort of the Jewish community, Jews in America, and Black folk in America. And so when we are having those conversations, I think what happens quite often is that many people, both Black, Jewish, today, myself included, and this past year has been a lot of unlearning and sort of learning again, sort of really rethinking how I was was viewing history. Okay, 3 minutes. A lot of that, we lift up this story of MLK and Heschel. And if you haven't, a great resource for this conversation is Professor Mark Dollinger's book. I believe it came out in 2018. It's called, it says Black Power, Jewish Politics. And it's a really, I wouldn't say it's a different take on the story and the relationship, but it really helps to frame this conversation in a way that I think is challenging for many of us, because it sort of shatters this idea that Blacks and Jews were really hand in hand fighting the good fight. At some point, yes, that was absolutely true. And then when we look sort of at historically the civil rights movement in the 1950s, mid 60s, there's a shift that happens where you get sort of this rising of Black power, Black nationalism, and it separates from the Jewish counterparts, which we then see happen again in 1967, in the 67 war in Israel, when I think many Jewish leaders are thinking about what it means to really be Jewish, what it really means to be autonomous, so much so that I believe the number, it's roughly 7,000 or 8,000 young American Jews literally get up and just go to Israel to help. There's no sort of infrastructure for them to help, but because they are so drawn to this idea of Jewish nationalism, Jewish identity, Jewish pride, they en masse get up and leave. So that's sort of the anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism here in America. Anti-Semitism, while it is incredibly vile and disgusting, was never codified the way that so many of the anti-Black laws here in America were. And so when we try to sort of shape this narrative that we have this shared history of oppression, the shared history of slavery, it's a really hard sale. And I would say a really good example of that, when we talk about Pesach, when we talk about Passover, and we say we know what it's like, we being Jewish here, take off the Black hat and put on the Jewish hat, we know what it's like to be oppressed and enslaved because we were once slaves too in Egypt. And the problem there is if we as Jews, and I would say as white passing Jews have to sort of go back to ancient Egypt to get the slavery metaphor, then it's missing, it's just missing so much, and it feels so out of touch. And it's really a slap in the face to Black folk in America, particularly with America's legacy of African American slavery. Sorry about that. And so there's a lot to sort of untangle there. And again, I say this not to make anyone uncomfortable, not to make anyone feel guilty, because again, it's written into our tradition, it's written into our Haggadot for us to say we know what it's like to feel oppressed, to feel enslaved, because we were once enslaved, but it doesn't ring true in terms of the Black experience because it feels so far removed. And I think when people think about slavery here in America, it's this thing that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I guess would be my great-grandmother, was born enslaved. My father's grandmother, her mother, was born enslaved 1850. And so just to sort of bring it closer home, it's really challenging when we sort of frame the conversation in that setting. When we talk about sort of the sociological, Jews experience marginalization, Black experience marginalization, it's true, and it's also sort of this warped narrative that happens, and we're sort of living in the repercussions of that narrative today, where the Black community and the Jewish community are so at opposite ends that by and large we don't really talk to each other, let alone like Jews like myself are caught in the middle and often are sort of removed from both groups because of that rift, or because people think that because you're a Black Jew or you're an Asian Jew, you can speak on behalf of the entire community. And the reality is the Black community, just like the Jewish community, is such a diverse community. We have Jews that are everything from Orthodox to Reform to secular to, I learned the other day there's something called a Boo Jew, a Buddhist Jew. I didn't know that was a thing, but now we all know. To Israelis, similarly within the Black community, you have folks that, for many of them, their identity is around the Black church experience. And even when I say the Black church experience, that too is so nuanced and so diverse that I could really talk about that for forever. And so when we look sort of at the nitty-gritty complex relationship of by and large Black communities and Jewish communities really coming out of the civil rights movement, we see that there was leadership, there was partnership, there was real relationship happening. And again, that shift in the mid-60s, where sort of the Black power, Black nationalist movement sort of starts to move away from the traditional civil rights movement. Jews are sort of left here to sort of figure things out on their own. And that generation, while the relationships continued within that generation, the next generation, so I would say anyone born sort of late 60s, early 70s, that narrative wasn't as strong, wasn't as true, because by and large, and I'm thinking of my parents right now, my parents could go to schools that didn't have restrictions, whereas their parents, if they could go to school, it was exclusively the Black school in their respective towns. Excuse me. And so you see that shift, and I think what makes the relationship, I would say, really challenging, particularly right now. If I was to take a poll here, I don't know how many of you would identify as white as your primary identity, or if you would identify as Jewish, but I would say there was a shift in the 60s and 70s where American Jews somehow earned whiteness. And because of that, society by and large, great point, I want to come back to that. Society by and large has now deemed Jews that don't look like me as white, and so it's sort of like being Italian. It's sort of this extra seasoning, it's a little bit of flavor, but it's nothing that's threatening to sort of whiteness as we understand whiteness. And so you see that shift. There's a decline in sort of openly anti-Semitic policies, anti-Semitic attacks from the 70s, I would say roughly until the 90s. Then there's an uptick again, and we know just from the last 15 months, particularly these last 6 months, anti-Semitic attacks have gone up 400%. And so with all of that, knowing that both anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness are intertwined, and our relationship is complex, because even though we know that both Jews and Black people in America are technically marginalized groups, there's a shift, and there's a real difference in how society perceives the two groups. And because of that societal perception, it sort of distorts things, not to mention, I always get the dates wrong, but in the 90s in Crown Heights, when the young man was killed, excuse me, and you see the Hasidic community there and the Black community there sort of erupt, and people say, oh, well, you know, there was this history where everyone was living in community together, but the reality is they were living just side by side. There was no real interaction, there was no real relationship. And out of that comes a Black Jewish dialogue group that I believe is still happening today. It might be less so today. And so when we are asking ourselves the question, when we are asking ourselves the questions of, you know, how do we address anti-Black racism? How do we address anti-Semitism within these respective communities? I would say the answer is a simple one, but it's not simple. It's really about being in relationship with the other. I think one of the biggest challenges, and where I really push many of our Jewish leaders, I certainly do it here with our student leaders, reaching out to show solidarity with any community that's experienced a hate crime or some sort of violation in that sense. It's a nice gesture, but if we've never sat down and had coffee, I've never been to one of your events, you've never come to one of my events, it's much harder to be in a relationship. And I think when I think of people who are really in relationship with others, the late great Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg comes to mind, and John Lewis come to mind, how despite being I think very firm in their individual politics, saw the importance of reaching across the aisle, really being in relationship with other people. I want to make sure. I did something and I can't see you all. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you and we can see you.
Hear you. I see you. I hear you.
Okay, 1 second. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there. So it's about that building of authentic relationships. It's about being curious to learn about the other, really being vulnerable to both ask questions, to receive feedback. One of my mentors, Karen Kalish, often says that, you know, I'm quoting her, we as white people, when we see a problem, we immediately want to run in and say, how can we help? And in that, how can we help? We generally think we have this idea of what that help looks like. And I would say, from my experience, that's very true, but where a lot of the tensions come up, a lot of the miscommunications, a lot of the bumping of heads, is that people aren't listening to what the other group needs. Excuse me. And so when we're sort of looking at this as I would call it a holistic approach, I think we have to talk about the historical memory. And so many of us have been taught this really beautiful narrative of Heschel and MLK and other religious leaders marching arm in arm and really working together behind the scenes to move justice forward. And from my own research, that isn't as true, I think, as many of us think it to be. We tend to remember what we want to remember, and we tend to forget what we want to forget. And as a history buff, I know that the evidence and the history tends to spin more positively than we want. Excuse me. Let me make sure I have the. I'm looking at my time. Last sort of thought here. In breaking down some of these barriers, we really need, as my grandmother would say, need to be good Americans to really critically investigate what we think our own narratives are, reach out to the people that don't look like us, that are different from us. If you only talk to the white high power executives, but you don't acknowledge maybe the Hispanic person or the Black person in the building who may or may not be working the front desk, really breaking down some of those barriers, really being willing to listen in an entirely different way than what we might have thought was productive and helpful. And I know Nancy was going to open it up to questions. Oh, Marilyn, am I saying that correctly? Marilyn put in the chat, I have always had a problem with the Pesach story. We are not slaves. We as Jews have no comprehension of slavery. Our immediate ancestors were not slaves. Perhaps though, our histories can help us work together. And Marilyn, I would say that you were 100% correct. I didn't grow up Jewish, and so there's this new push to sort of totally disregard, I think, what was a historical Black-Jewish alliance. And I would say we don't need to totally disregard it. I think we need to really look at it at under a critical lens. And I think you can say our ancestors way back when, yes, they were slaves. And I think by saying what you just said in the chat, if more Jews, more Jewish institutions were to actually vocalize, yes, our ancestors were slaves way back when, but we don't have that lived experience of what it's like to be enslaved. I think that would really, really move the needle forward.
Thank you. And you pronounced my name right.
Oh, thank you.
So if the rest of you who have questions would type them into the chat, then I can sort of forward them verbally to Tony and keep the conversation rolling. And while you're doing that, I'll get started first with a thank you to Tony for reminding us of the Black Power Jewish Politics book. Actually, Mark Dollinger was our kickoff speaker for this series, thanks to the connections that Terry Weiss brings to our group. And I immediately wrote that book down as a must read, and now have to confess that I have not must read it. So I hope it puts it back on the front burner for some of the rest of you as well. But assuming that I might not be the only person in that position, Tony, you had referenced anti-Black laws, and I wonder if you can be a little more specific about, I assume that you're talking one place to which we can go back would be Jim Crow laws, and how those not only operated in that time, but then the repercussions of that echoing still today.
Absolutely. So I don't know if I said it in my introduction, but I because of my job, I spend a lot of time, probably too much time, on social media, particularly a newer app called TikTok. It's essentially, it's essentially 60-second clips where people can talk about whatever they want. Often it's just them doing weird, silly dances. And the other day, there was an older Black gentleman who said, he just sort of popped up on my For You page and said, "Oh, do you know what the side-eye law is?" He then went on to explain it, because I was like, what is that? And this was a law that was on the books in the South, I think up until 1950. It essentially was, because many of the Jim Crow laws were designed to sort of keep newly freed Black individuals in a legal enslavement. This law said that if I as a Black person, trying to figure out the grammar, if I as a Black person was walking down the street, and Nancy, I hope you don't mind if I use you as an example, and I happened to look at Nancy just for a bit, and not in any sort of lustful way, just we're walking on the same street, I happen to look at her, I could be arrested, jailed, beaten, and then I would have to pay Nancy back for damages. And it's laws like that that we think are incredibly ridiculous, because they are, and laws like that still existed on the books for more than half a century. The law that always comes to mind when I think about this, particularly in terms of restrictions for voting rights in the South, was the soap bubble sort of test. Whether you could sort of read or write, I think they assumed that most Black folk couldn't read or write, but when people were trying to register, it was crazy things like how many bubbles on this bar of soap, which, unless you actually sat there and counted them before they popped, and it's just sort of crazy things like that, that again were still on the books in many rural places in the Deep South until the early 70s, and no one, it was really only after sweeping legislation nationwide that it sort of trickled down to these little places in the Deep South. I think many people might be familiar with, obviously segregation is one of the sort of the biggest things that come out of the Jim Crow laws. This past weekend, I think it was the 50th anniversary of the Loving Day case, where it officially banned interracial marriages that took effect across America. I'm seeing lots of questions. Let's see. Sally, that's a great question. I'm gonna answer, I think, your second one first. So how do you address the facts that Jews have been dealing with the Spanish Inquisition, pogroms, excuse me, and the Holocaust. I am a huge believer in experiential education. And I want to say this delicately, not that I'm not suggesting that people experience a pogrom or anything like that. But so many Holocaust museums throughout the country, the one that I'm thinking of in particular in DC, while I will never know firsthand what it's like to go through such a traumatic, such a visceral event in my life, that experience as a high school student is something that I think about often. It really informs the way that I call out anti-Semitism. And I know for my friends who weren't Jewish that went through the program with me, we all had that same experience. And it's great to see when someone has posted something or someone makes a Holocaust joke and they think, oh, it's not really hurting anyone. And they don't realize how they are perpetuating anti-Semitism and sort of this white supremacy. And I would say, I've done a lot of research on the Spanish Inquisition. And if you look at some of I lived in Jerusalem for a while, and the Israel Museum had a really wonderful maybe isn't the right word, but it had a really interesting exhibit on Spanish Jewry pre-Inquisition. And to see some of the testimonies from people that fled, the Spanish Inquisition was the Holocaust of for that generation. One of the eyewitnesses talks about this famed rabbi who refused to leave the town. He encouraged all of his congregants to leave for their safety, but he refused to leave. And the Spaniards did terrible things to him. How do we reach out to African-American people and vice versa to make stronger connections between Jews and African-Americans? And where do we start? That is the question of the hour. Again, I think it goes back to the want of being in authentic relationships with people, not partnering with people. We have this great program. We would love to have you buy a table, or we'd love to have you come speak at our event, and sort of vice versa, but really being in relationship. Maharat Rory Pickernice is sort of my go-to example for an individual who's really in relationship with other members of non-Jewish communities here in St. Louis. And yes, it started off, I think as many relationships start off as sort of a work relationship, or there's some sort of mutual project that people are working on. But it's really about getting out there, getting to know them outside of the work, getting to know them as the individual, what they're passionate about, what lights their fire, and sharing yourself with them, being vulnerable enough to do that. And I think what has shifted really within I would say in my lifetime, I'm only 33, but within my lifetime, is that everything has become so polarized, and it feels like everyone is afraid to ask a question or to say something, and fear that they might offend the other person. And I would say, I think that's a piece that we Americans, Black, Jews, whomever, we sort of collectively need to work through, because if we're afraid to talk to the person who's sitting across the table who looks differently than us, for fear that we might say the wrong thing, it means that we never say a thing, and so there's no connection there. Thank you for this question, Bert. What is the source of hostility from some Black leaders, specifically towards Jews, Louis Farrakhan, Jesse Jackson used the term Hymietown in reference to New York, rather than as whites in general. That is a complicated answer. Louis Farrakhan, it doesn't come to anyone's surprise, is like openly very anti-Semitic. And I would say that, and I know Nancy mentioned this earlier, sort of the Israel-Palestine conflict earlier. It's that whiteness piece, and to tack on sort of, oh, and they're Jew. So I would say that really in Farrakhan, in his case, it's a lot of sort of anti-white rhetoric, but because we are Jews and Jews who appear to be white, it's easy to latch on. Professor Dolinger talks extensively, actually, about Farrakhan and Jackson in his book, and I don't have the book with me in my office, but he like devotes 2 or 3 chapters, and it's a really interesting read. Yes, it is. Nancy, can you say more about that? Oh, I think you're muted.
Do you mean about my comment in the chat?
Yes.
So a few years ago, our Rabbi Michael went on a Israel trip that was cross-cultural and became pretty good friends with Reverend Roderick Burton, who pastors a Protestant church on the north side. And there was discussion at the time about constructing some interaction, because as almost anybody would admit, St. Louis is set up geographically and culturally to make it incredibly difficult to get to know enough people across the obvious dividing line to ever be in relationship. It really takes a lot of effort to make that happen. I remember one night when a group of congregants from Reverend Burton's church attended services at TI, which is really lovely, but it looked like the junior high dance, you know, with all the people that looked one way on one side of the room and all the people who looked different on the other side of the room. And I feel like we know better, and now we should be able to do better, but that we need to consciously find ways to facilitate that interaction as one just obvious open door to the potential of some relationships.
I agree 100%. I think what was so impactful for me through the cultural leadership program, we had to opt into the program. We had to apply, were accepted or rejected. And for the students that were accepted, every session we had to opt into being there. We had to opt into really being comfortable with that discomfort of not knowing the other. I think there are, like, for example, TI, I think, has the ability, like many other Jewish organizations, to find other sort of faith-based groups or other cultural groups here in St. Louis to partner. And it has to start off with that one-to-one interaction. And I absolutely agree. My first session in cultural leadership, you're right, it was exactly like a junior high dance. All the Black kids were on side, all the Jewish kids were on the other side. And it wasn't until we had to do something called, what is it? We do it at summer camp, didactic encounters, where essentially it was someone who you didn't know, who looked physically different from you. We had a list of questions, and it was just two people plopped sort of all across the room and just sitting and talking and getting to know each other. And even in that sort of initial conversation, you know, I immediately saw, oh, this person that goes to Ladue, like, also struggles with math. I would think because you go to Ladue, you have all of these resources, you're super smart, you're super whatever, but you also struggle with math the way that I struggle with math. Or, oh, you also like to watch this TV show, or, oh, you also like to, you know, dance or do whatever it is. And I think we've just reached a point, and I really think it's the tipping point, where we need leaders, where we need really anyone with a sort of public platform to really model what it looks like to extend that hand, to bring the other person in and to really get to know each other. Not to get political, but I think the last 4 years, this last administration, really showed us exactly what not to do. And I was excited when the new administration came in, not because I'm anti-Trump or whatever, but because I felt like you had individuals who were actually willing to talk to the other person, to really try to build some sort of relationship and coalition. And unfortunately, I just don't think that happens anymore. And you mentioned sort of the way St. Louis is set up. We are still one of the most racially segregated cities in America. And it is, when I tell my friends who don't live here, they're like, oh, you mean like parts of the town, there's like an Italian town and there's like a Chinatown. I'm like, no, you can walk across one of the streets and it's a totally different presence and vibe. And it's just, there's all of these systems that are set up to just keep us apart. And we have to just start dismantling them. I can't see the chat, there we are. To what extent would, this is a question, to what extent would I say, if any, does the inherent colonial mentality of Christianity play in the divisions between the Black church community and the white Jewish community? Would you say there is subtle anti-Semitism that is at play with regard to the intent to convert non-Christians that may be a stumbling block to intercommunal dialogue? I want to make sure I get all the parts right. I would say yes. So I am actually taking, it's called Daring Chaplaincy, Movement Chaplaincy, and it's to provide individuals the tools to support people that are in quote unquote the movements, whether that's Black Lives Matter, hashtag say no to anti-Asian hate, whatever the social movement is. It was identified that there's a lack of sort of care for people's spiritual, ethical, personal needs. And so this course was developed. I'm about 3 weeks into the course, and last week's subject matter was really looking at sort of the Christian church as an institution and how it has played a really detrimental role sort of in building relationships with non-Christians, with Indigenous people, with Black people. And to answer the question, I would say yes. There's this notion, for me, and there was just an article in the Atlanta paper about this, how you have more and more young Black Americans sort of leaving, quote unquote, the church. It's not a phenomenon that's like just in the Black church. We see it in our communities. We see it sort of in religious communities everywhere. But one of the the most common responses of why is, let me pull up the article. It quotes this 40-year-old who works in Atlanta saying, you know, I left because I didn't connect with sort of the idea of Jesus, and it's sort of a real slave mentality. Why in so many Black churches is there a white Jesus? If Jesus was real, he lived in the Middle East and wasn't blonde haired and blue eyed, which I think, just sort of historically speaking, if Jesus is from the Middle East, it's less likely that he looks sort of distinctively European. And I know someone asked the question earlier of sort of what made me convert to Judaism. Well, that wasn't a big piece. I will say it was something that I always struggled with growing up. You had an entire community of Black and brown people who were praying to this white individual, and something about that just didn't feel right. And for many reasons, sort of Christianity just sort of didn't work for me, and Judaism did. How do we reach out to members of Congress who are pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel, including Congresswoman Cori Bush? Sally, great question. I wish I had an easy 5-step plan. This is how you do it. I think in Congresswoman Bush's case, I know she's sort of part of that pack where it's AOC and some other Congress women that on one hand will say things like, you know, we condemn anti-Semitism, but in the same breath will say something that is very clearly anti-Israel, which in the argument of dialogue, I would say, okay, but that anti-Israel rhetoric, it's such a thin line, and it very quickly becomes anti-Semitic again. And it's really challenging for me because I know that Congresswoman Bush's, part of her district includes U City, and there are a number of Jews there, so you can't say that you can't say that you really represent everyone if you were totally unwilling to talk to anyone from the Jewish community. You could write, you can call. I think calling your particular representative, really expressing your concern to get them to reach out is one way. But I feel like it's a group of them, and I'm forgetting what sort of the media calls them, but I know it's AOC. It's
the squad.
The squad. Thank you. For me, I think what's really challenging about the squad isn't whatever their political leanings are, or what they publicly say, or what crazy things they say on Twitter. It's the fact that they claim to represent everyone, and it seems like when everyone isn't exactly aligned with them, then that door to communication is totally closed, and it's just challenging. And I don't have an answer outside of sort of contacting our current people and to ask them to reach out to say, look, this is important to me. You represent me. This individual is saying X, Y, and Z. How are you going to address that? Other questions? Excuse me.
Well, I feel like, Tony, that you've addressed the things that are in the chat. Obviously, this is not an uncomplicated topic, not anything that we're going to solve tonight, but I certainly do feel like you've given us a lot to think about. We did have one question just pop up, and if you don't mind giving us another minute or two, The question was, have you seen a rise in anti-Semitism at WashU, and how are students responding to that if it is indeed happening?
So I would say that it's not anti-Semitism in the way I think that we all know how to define anti-Semitism. It's anti-Israel rhetoric. It's anti-Semitic rhetoric that's masking as anti-Israel / Free Palestine rhetoric. And right before the engagement in Gaza in mid-May, we just had a wonderful panel discussion on anti-Semitism and building allies within sort of the community here. We then had another session where it was just the students. It was so great to see on the screen because it was white, Black, Jew, non-Jew, Muslim student, and everyone was excited to sort of be in community together to really start this work to address issues of anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, all of the isms here on campus. The engagement in Gaza started, and I would say within a 2-week period, many of the minority student groups here on campus all put out these statements, being very pro-Palestinian, which again is fine, but then many of those statements were followed up with anti-Israel rhetoric that anyone with a brain would see was incredibly anti-Semitic. The way that they talked about Israelis, or some of the pictures that they used, were these clear historical depictions, anti-Semitic depictions of what Jews look like. One group, and I don't even know if they're an actual group here on WashU's campus, released a statement about, they're so happy that other people are rising up and really seeing the plight of the Palestinian people. Again, I think Palestine should be free, but let's talk about the logistics. Let's talk about what that actually looks like. And I don't want to misquote it, and I have it somewhere on my phone, but it said, it's time that we rise up and free WashU of the Zionist controllers. WashU won't be its puppet anymore. And it was both infuriating, that there's a sort of this vague student group that claims to represent students saying this. It was incredibly alarming because of that sort of Zionist puppet anti-Semitic trope that they were clearly using. And I think the thing that was also really alarming for me and for students was the number of likes that post got. I think it was over 1,000 within the day. I also think that we had the advantage that when all of those posts started happening, commencement was the very next week. And that, I think that post came out on a Wednesday. Friday evening, WashU announced the lifting of most of their restrictions. And so many of the students, COVID restrictions, excuse me. And so many of the students were just really preoccupied with commencement and moving out and going home in the end of the semester. But we started checking in with our students immediately after, and many of them are very nervous about the fall. It's a conversation that I should say, unfortunately, it's an unfortunate conversation that sort of, I think, many Jewish communities have to have, sort of increased safety, and what does it look like if we hold an Israel-themed program and we have people protesting it, so it's all very complicated, and I know that I am over on time. But
we were waiting for you to solve it, Tony. it was worth the extra 8 minutes to get a solution. Reminder to everyone that this was the fourth of a 4-part series, but is by no means the end of the educational process that will pick up again, I guess, in the fall. Our education subcommittee of TI's relatively new Justice and Equity Committee meets maybe tomorrow. I'll have to check my calendar, but in the next couple of days to start planning future programming. So if you have particular speakers or particular topics that you feel would be important for us to explore, if you or anyone you know is interested in diving into a book study of Drollinger's book about Black Power Jewish politics, I'd be super interested in organizing that. And with that, I will say good night, and hopefully we will see you live at services in the next week or so. And thank you again so deeply to Tony for joining us, for sharing in such a really thoughtful way. And I will heartily recommend that you use that link to go to the Jewish Light website and read his opinion piece as well. Thanks to all of you for being here, and more to come. Your input welcome.
Thank you.
Nancy, thank you for allowing me to speak. I put my email in the chat, and I mean, yes, I have a full-time job, but I always want to be in community with other people. And now that, you know, restrictions are lifting, we can meet over Zoom, we can take a walk in the park. Feel free to reach out if you have questions or something comes up for you and you want to talk through. I am here.
Thank you so much, Tony.
Tony, I was going to also invite you, because I know that during the school year you are otherwise committed on Friday nights for Kabbalat Shabbat, but I think we would love to have you at TI sometime and join us for services during the summer when you aren't otherwise committed at Halal.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thanks. We would love that. Totally love it. All right. Thanks again to all of you for being here and for participating in the whole series. And like I said, more to come. And our committee is always looking for additional voices. So let us know if that's something you'd like to participate in. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.